Okay, let's look at a new article on the Picts, written by Stephen Keith, whose name comes into play here in a little bit. On the left, you see a depiction of a Pict. You can see that he's naked, but like a thrall warrior we had talked about before, is tattooed all over his body. It's a black and white image, but they were well known to have been tattooed. He has a trident, spear, a man's head cut off, ships in the background, and another dead head below him. But you can notice that his sword looks very scimitarish, almost something we would think out of from Indiana Jones, the guy he shoots. The Middle East. There's a reason for that too. On the right, we're seeing a Scythian type warrior, showing that he has a primitive type war axe there, smaller than normal, looks kind of odd. Spear and a bow in his other hand, and a quiver. Quiver is carried in a forward carriage and not over his shoulder. He also has a conspicuous Phrygian type cap that we've talked about far too many times. So let's just get into this here. Piecing together the origins of ancient Near East names in Scotland. Thinking of Scotland as I do from somewhat similar mountains of northern India, where this man stays now, which has been my home for nigh on 20 years, I do so from a rather Indian perspective. I think of families, clans, and tribes living on land that they consider to be their ancestral lands. However, they have an understanding, kept alive in stories from both manuscript and memory, that those same ancestors had themselves migrated from their ancestral lands in the far-off past, from the Far East and Middle East. Nice car. What began as a fascination with origins of the peoples of the Himalayan ranges, done by some people in the 30s in archaeology, led quite naturally to an interest in where we all came from and our origins. The Indians, of course, as the most ancient of civilizations, or so we are told by some, had an understanding of the world, when and how it was made, and more importantly for this piece, who populated it and where they settled. Here we're seeing a picture of a Scottish get-together, some of the men wearing kilts, doing dances. It was a Highland wedding. Soon to jump the broom. The Code of Manu, one of the more ancient of the Vedic texts that form part of the liturgy of the Hindus, which we were all at one time in our human history, is the Code of Manu, the lawgiver, not coincidentally similar to Maru, the lawgiver of Japanese culture, or Minos of Crete, Men of the Egyptians, or Moses, who we're perhaps more familiar with. The laws of Manu tell that from the caste of the Kshatriyas sprung up peoples they knew as the Yavanas, and that we know as Greeks. The Pahavlas, or Persians, as we know them, and others would eventually form the cultures of Siam, or ancient Siam, China, Burma, and Tibet, and the people to us known as Scythian, but called Saka or Sakasuni to the Sanskrit writers. The Scythians are mentioned in the Old Testament too, as are many of the same names of the nations of people described and located in other contemporary texts and tablets, the Egyptians and the Hittites of Anatolia being the two others who were to play leading roles in helping us to make significant strides in understanding the ancient and transcendental culture that was to become Scotland eventually. Accounts of ancient inhabitants. In the Scottish peoples, there's a declaration of Arbroath, which our readers will no doubt probably be familiar with. The authors gave a brief history of their forefathers and their journey and the Europe of that time. Although it was written in the 14th century, the document is remarkably similar to the stories written centuries before by the Greeks, Romans, and the English writer Venerable Bede, to name but a few. The 7th century Saint Isidore, writing in his Encyclopedia of Knowledge, drew from ancient Latin and Greek sources and recorded that the ancient inhabitants of what is now Spain and Portugal, and was then known as Iberia, were the warlike Haspirines, a name not too dissimilar to the Hibernians or Hibernia or Ireland. This is a picture of that declaration, or this is the one that's known as the Tyringham copy of the Declaration of Arbroath, written on vellum. We know that the Atlantic seaboard provided the route for genes to move from south to north as North Europe was repopulated after the ice that had marked that age had receded and reshaped the land and sea. The genes had names, and names tell story even if they change after generations of whispers. We talk about this Younger Dryas event quite often. He's talking about a repopulation of an area from before. The Scots of Ulster and Dalriada asserted that they had hailed from the marriage of an Egyptian pharaoh's daughter, Scota, which means little flower, and a Scythian general named Goidelglas of her father's army, who had refused to pursue the Israelites as they fled across the Red Sea. They settled in exile with their entourage in Ulster as the Scots and gave the country their and her name, Scotia. This is a depiction I've shown a few times before of them coming in the ships, and this is Scotia, the Egyptian princess of Akhenaten. In the old German spoken, in ancient times, the word for Scotland and for Scythian is the same. It is Scutin. The Scythian peoples dominated the steppe north of the Black Sea at that time, a matrilineal culture in which people painted their bodies or tattooed them and had developed an extraordinary high standard of craftsmanship with metal, particularly gold. They faded from history at about the time that scholars first began to describe another matrilineal body painting metalworking people known as the Picts. Or were they the same people? And another question, when you look at the Scythians and how they used to paint their bodies with blue, and then later we find out these people in the area had all these connections with blue to it, is there not a wavering back and forth of a people from before? Curious Caithness. Pictland was an amalgamation of minor kingdoms, the northernmost being Cate, that eventually would give its name to the country we now know as Caithness. To the Gaelic speakers of Dalriada in Ireland, the part of Pictland known as Cate was known as Cata, meaning among the Cates, or among the cats. And to the Norse-speaking Orcadians, it was called Catanis. It's a headland of the cats. According to the 7th century historian Sir Robert Gordon, in 82 A.D., the two boatloads of warriors had arrived in Caithness from their lands in Friesland, Batavia. You know that now as the Netherlands these days. They had made their home after retreating there from southern part of the Roman province of Germania, in the area of modern-day Hesse, which had been occupied by the legions of Rome in the decades that had preceded. Here we can see the ruins of Bad Herigo farmstead, Oakley, and Caithness. These people were known as the Chatti. History goes on to tell us that the chief of the Chatti had married a daughter of the Pictish king Brude, and by the name of Kenneth MacAlpin. King Alpin, or Alpine, had joined the Pictish and Pictish thrones. and the Sennacheres had named Gili Catin Noir, or Knight, as the chief of the Chatti. Clan Keith are descended from him, as well as the clans of Mackenzie, McPherson, Sutherland, and Davidson, known as the Confederation of Clan Catin. Well, how do the Hittites fit in, and what are we getting at here? Well, in Old German, Hesse was known as Hatti, same name that they gave to the Hittites of Anatolia that we know of very well, to the south of the Black Sea in that area, and the same name the Hittites knew themselves by. The Egyptians knew the Hittites as the Kethi, or Kethi, and that has connections too. The emblem of both the Hatti, or Kethi, and the Chatti, or Hatti, was the black cat. The black cat remains on the banners of the Earls of Sutherland and Clan Catin, each themselves descendant of the Chatti Pictish nobility. Here we can see a crest, and in your right you can see a man holding a heart, and above that is what looks like a set of levels or a teeter-totter with weights suspended from them, and they have symbols of Taurus on them. Center of the crest is important, and it shows you that these people are very much a ship-faring type people. Also shows you which way the winds were blowing. It's so important it becomes the bottom part of the shield, but the bottom left there in its blue is a boar, but some has said that that used to be a hippopotamus. But the connections to the Scythians would be a connection of a boar, wouldn't it? Here we have the lion in the top left-hand corner, and this same lion can be seen in a few people's flags from the same area in all northwestern Europe, I guess you would call it. As a kid, one of the first times I saw this exact form of a lion was on a Lowenbrau beer bottle. It's kind of odd. I had a friend that didn't like just regular beers, wouldn't buy Coors and stuff. Usually what he wanted to get was a 6-pack of Molson or Lowenbrau or some exotic beers and stuff, which was pretty cool. But I always had something to go with beer, or could tell him about the history of beers, as I knew about it at that time, and Sumerians and how far long beer went back and so on. So there's that sacred lion too, again. That's the arms of the captain or chief of the Catin Confederation, by the way. The Indo-European Hittites, Aryan Hittites, had been amongst those at the forefront of civilizations of the time, pioneers of the Bronze Age's technology and advancements. They were the first to introduce codified civil and criminal law as we know it. Indeed, the first example of an international peace treaty to conclude a wars between the Hittites and the Mitanni of northern Mesopotamia, that Tigris and Euphrates area, signed by their leaders under oath before the Indic gods, by the way, Varuna, Indra, Mitra, and Nasatya, which I have shown you in a lot of, well, I've shown you in a couple of videos that Indra is listed as being a pale, golden-haired Soma drinker quite a few times in the Mahabharata. And there are other connections, and of course we've talked about Mitra or Mithras. A copy of this legal first adorns the United Nations building in New York City, by the way, as a testament to what can be achieved by the meditation of people rather than militarism. Well, what does red hair and blue eyes got to do with it all? Scotland is populated from the collapsing civilizations of the Mediterranean and the Near East. From the Hittites and Scythians of the Black Sea, the Egyptians, and I dare say some of the sons of Esau, who had married into both Hittite and Egyptian royalty, and whose genetic characteristics of red hair and blue eyes are still disproportionately found in the blood of the Scots. I recently did a series of 2 different vids showing you that the Scots had ancient North African ancestry, and it's been double verified now, or more, and that the ancient Irish show a big connection to the Holy Lands and the people there. I've also made other videos about the tribe of Dan and where the Danube gets written in from, and all of that dispersion that came back out that had once been squished into the Middle East from before, as he's speaking of. Muhammad was a redhead. Quite a few of the Egyptian nobility were redheads. King David was a redhead. They can be seen in all kinds of Egyptian art, Mitanni art of the time, and of course you know there's components of that are in the Greeks. But also all of North Africa, and in the ancient people that lived there that we know of as the Amazigh, or the Berbers, and still a huge remnant of people that have an outstanding percentage of blonde and redheads, along with green and blue eyes. Around the globe, between 1 and 2% of the people have red hair, a figure that rises to 13% or so in Scotland, with almost 40% being carriers of the genes. You know, it takes 2 to get together, and then you'll have redhead kids and so on, they've talked about. But not always. And you can have things that are slightly dormant come show up, i.e. Prince Charles. They had a ginger kid, and his wife wasn't a ginger either. In the Ashkenazi Jewish community, significantly higher than average levels of red hair are detected, but not nearly the same level found amongst the modern-day Scots and Irish. Indeed, in Europe and Russia, red hair was associated with Jewish people, and in Spain during the Inquisition, red hair could be a death sentence based on these same prejudices. So here you can see a redhead. 13% of Scottish people have red hair and blue eyes, but so did Typhon, and so did Set of the Egyptians, and Seti, and that's the reason it seems that they had gotten their names, for they're separated in their graveyards due to hair color. And it seems like due to hair color, they would say that you had gotten something from the ancient. The building of Hadrian's Wall guaranteed that those families on the northern side were isolated, and the distinctive systems of clans that would come to define the country could develop. The ancient bloodlines that had long before sought refuge and sanctuary on the fringes of known world could be bonded together and maintain themselves as a united collective amidst the mayhem and murder that would come to mark the dark and Middle Ages that were to come. The fact that these people remained out of the formal Roman Empire meant that they could define themselves as being free and independent, as well as maintain their distinctive culture until the union with England in 1603. Indeed, Samuel Johnson, the Doctor of Letters, who gave the world the first English dictionary and who was the preeminent English academic of his time, had lamented that with a Stuart on the throne in London, the Jewish habits of the Scots had infiltrated and polluted the good Christian peoples of his green and pleasant lands. Could go on and on about the Stuarts, but I don't need to. That's Prince Charles Edward Stuart, eldest son of Prince James Francis Edward Stuart. Perhaps these habits stemmed from these early settlers from the Middle East who gave us the contents of their memory and their minds, as well as the confidence that emanates from a successful, proven people. It's this ancient heritage embedded in the subconscious of our people that means that to this day we will always consider ourselves as being free and independent, irrespective of our circumstances or what had happened at times, and as being Scots from Scotland. And again, he writes this from India. So if we put together this and the 6 other videos that I've got on the topic, if not 10, one would realize that genetics and, in fact, a lot of literature, including this document here, is showing you that they knew this all in ancient times. And while it tried to be blotted out and forgotten through the Dark Ages they talk about, it didn't quite happen. And now when people look back and they have disconnects somewhat and seem to have an amnesia effect, whenever you look through each one of these civilizations that we talk about, there are portions of that ended up making who you were eventually in these people here and in northwestern Europe. An incredible plethora of connections. Like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already, and enjoy, and we'll get on to another one. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Peace.